Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this, the latest in the MRSC series, exploring issues affecting longevity. I can see our numbers are still ticking up, so we'll just give everyone a minute to arrive before we make a start. Okay, still going up, but I think, sensibly speaking, we should make a start. So, for over 10 years, since its publication in 2009, the CMI's Mortality Projection Model has been playing a key role in restoring the actuarial profession's reputation for expertise in assessing future longevity trends. Our younger viewers may not recall, but during the 90s and noughties, our failure, or some failure, to adequately anticipate and allow for the co-effect required the profession to rethink how it was considering longevity, and this exercise ultimately resulted in the CMI's model. Whether used directly or as a benchmark to assess internal expectations against, the CMI model has provided a common currency that has allowed our stakeholders to better understand and have confidence in the advice we provide. The COVID-19 pandemic obviously disrupted the ability of the model to provide these annual updates of the model and did not take into account the experience in 2020 and 2021. But earlier this year, CMI 2022 was released and represents the first step towards return to the normal functioning of the CMI model. CMI 22, under the default parameters, produces significantly lower levels of projected mortality improvements. But is the change we're observing the new norm, and will future iterations of the model confirm what's seen in CMI 2022? Or should we expect that the outputs of the CMI model, without significant changes in the default parameters year on year, to evidence instability in the next few years? Joining me to discuss this issue and the implications for longevity practitioners are Nick Chadwick, Roshan Tajapra, and Matt Fletcher. So I'll just give those guys a bit of an introduction. So Nick is a longevity actuary with extensive experience in advising both life insurers and pension schemes on the measurement and management of longevity risk. He is a member of Club Vita's Products Research and Development team, where he leads the development of Club Vita's suite of digital products. Roshan is the Deputy Head of Longevity Research at SCORE, where he is responsible for the development of SCORE's mortality trend assumptions for various global markets. He has worked as a longevity specialist for 10 years at various insurers and reinsurers, and is a member of the IFA's Diabetics Working Party Steering Group. Matt is an associate partner at Aon. His over 20 years consultancy experience, including over 10 years as a specialist in mortality and longevity. He works in Aon's Demographic Horizons team, advising insurance companies and pension schemes on setting best estimates and evaluating risk for longevity and other demographic assumptions, both in the UK and overseas. Matt chairs the CMI Self-Administered Pension Schemes Committee, which produces mortality tables that are used extensively in the pensions and insurance industries. So, welcome. To kick us off, Roshan's going to give us a quick presentation that will set the scene and highlight the key considerations that will frame the discussion we'll have following. Roshan, over to you.
Thanks, Sacha. I'm just going to share some slides. So, CMI model. As Sacha said, it's an industry model, and we've had this model since 2009. Now, I like to think of the CMI model as a model of two halves when I try to explain it to people. It starts off in mortality space, um, and the aim here is to smooth through the past mortality experience. And you can see here, this is CMI 21 on the left here. And yeah, it looks like it's doing relatively well until we hit the pandemic period, of course. Under the default parameters, there's nil weight placed on these 2 years. We then move to improvement space, where the recent past, and this is the key theory underlying the CMI model, the trends in the recent past are somewhat indicative of the trends in the near future. And we have a separate trend for cohorts and a separate trend for age period. Then the trends in the long term are the bits which is uncertain. So the CMI don't apply a default parameter for the long-term rate. They set that to the user. Okay, so we've had a pandemic. How does the CMI model handle the pandemic? Well, as we've said before, the 2020 and 2021 have been excluded from the default parameterization of the model, and 25% weight was applied to 2022. As in the consultation paper, the CMI have stated that mortality in 22 may be indicative of future mortality to some extent. But they did caveat that, saying that there is quite a lot of uncertainty in the projection. Also in that paper, there was a indicative weight for 2023, some signposting of how the model might get back to what's normal. How do we get back to applying 100% weight to data? We might see something in the future for 50% weight for 2023, 75% weight for 2024, and 100% weight for 2025. Now, the CMI did say that this was still under consideration, and it may not be, the default parameterization of CMI 23 onwards. So, what does this mean? Well, there's been a lot of analysis done by the CMI and others to just show the range of uncertainty for applying different weights and where 2023 might lie going forward. The Q3 mortality monitor is one of the more recent one of those, and it shows that there is considerable differences to life expectancies depending on what weight you apply to 2022 and 2023 data, and where 2023 might end up. Is it going to look somewhat similar to in the next quarter to 2022, or is it going to look more similar to 2019? So, as you can see, with the big range that there is, I wanted to run an exercise and look at what happens if we take the heaviest part of that range, and what happens if future 2023 looks similar to 2022. And if we assume that the default parameterization of CMI 23 will have 50% weight on 23 and 25% weight on 2022, how does the model react to it? Well, you can see here that the model is essentially resetting in mortality space to the current level of mortality. Now, it hasn't quite got there yet because we're only applying 50% weight to 2023, 25% weight to 2022. But essentially, we're moving the dial upwards in terms of mortality to get to a new vision of where current mortality lies. Now, remember the key theory underlying the CMI model is that when you move to the projection in improvement space, trends in the recent past are somewhat indicative of trends in the near future. Now here, because of this resetting effect that's going on, the recent trend is negative. So we're seeing disimprovement in the recent past. And that feeds through to the projection where although the cohort element hasn't quite changed that much, the age period is all negative pretty much. And so we really have to question whether this original theory underlying the CMI model does it still hold in the post-pandemic world? Certainly, it was a good theory pre-pandemic, but perhaps we need to reconsider the options in the post-pandemic period. You can see here, setting the scene, that there's several different outcomes of the CMI model from CMI 21 onwards. The most extreme being CMI 23, which projects disimprovement at many of the key ages for pensioners up until 2030. And this is because of that key assumption that trends in the recent past, as the model resets to that, it projects that resetting forwards before going to your higher long-term rate. So questions for the panel, and I don't want to step on Sacha's toes here, but the discussion we're going to have is around, should COVID-19 be in the base or in the trend, or a mixture of both? How is data used and interpreted within the CMI model? And how is the CMI model used within the industry? And are we still getting as much value out of it as we did in 2009? With that, I'll hand back to Sacha.
Excellent, Roshan. That's a perfect introduction. So I'm going to bring in the other panelists and ask a range of questions covering those three areas. But just to note, if you have got any questions, please add them to the chat as we're going along, and we'll hopefully have some time at the end of the webinar to bring in some questions from the audience. So let's start with my first question. How should we conceptually be allowing for these reads and patterns? If we use the traditional paradigm, should we be allowing for them in base or in trend, or both? Or is the base trend paradigm not the best way to think about longevity anymore? And I'll start by bringing in, who do I give this one to first? Matt, would you like to pick that one up?
Easy first question. So, I mean, I think in terms of the way that the CMI model works, ultimately it's about whether recent patterns of mortality are likely to be predictive of what might happen in future years, or at least the extent to which they might be helpful to, or useful to help us predict what might happen in future years. And I think it's pretty clear that the pandemic experience over 2020 and 2021 is exceptional and wouldn't be expected to recur. But as sort of Roshan's pointed out, and I'm sure most people on the call will be aware, mortality in 2022 and 2023 does remain higher than pre-pandemic years. And yeah, there is a question as to how you actually allow for that. It seems sensible to think that 2022 and 2023 are at least partially predictive of future years. However, I think it could sensibly be viewed as a combination of a change in level and a change in trend. So by definition, COVID-19 is a new cause of death that wouldn't have been expected pre-pandemic. So that kind of leads you to some sort of a base level shift. How large that might be, causes of death, but so clearly there will be some impact of COVID-19 on mortality sort of generally, and then equally clearly I think that there is some sort of ongoing impact, whether direct, so as a direct cause of people having had infection COVID-19, but also kind of the indirect effects on the NHS, on healthcare more generally, the longer term impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic. So yeah, I think sort of hedging the answer a little bit, but I think there is an element of both. My sense is that it's more towards the trend sort of side of things, certainly in the longer term, but that there is an argument for doing something for the base as well.
Nick, what would you add to that?
Yeah, so your question was, is anything broken with the base and trend paradigm? And I don't think there is. I just think we need to be explicit about what counts as base table, what counts as trend. So we usually work with the base table, which applies at some point in the past. And then we use an improvement assumption for two different purposes. So the first one is either to roll that base table to the present day, or maybe to roll it to a different year if you want to get some QX rates from an experience study. But we also use it to estimate future improvements from the present day. And those are two different problems. And the problem with using the same smooth projection for both those purposes is that we might very reasonably want a different gradient to apply in the short-term past and the short-term future. And I think this is a classic example of that. Just because mortality rates are higher in 2022 than they were in 2019 doesn't mean we expect mortality rates to continue to go up. So that's a pretty big problem with the CMI model and the way it smooths through the pandemic period data. I don't think that means the sort of fundamental theory is broken. I think we just need to, as longevity actuaries, think a bit harder about how we deal with this lumpy data.
Let's turn our attention to some of the conceptual assumptions underpinning the calibration of the CMI model, both in terms of the default and the more advanced parameters. Roshan, which aspects of those conceptual assumptions do you think are remaining appropriate in terms of how we project mortality rates over the next 20 years, and which of those do you think probably need some further consideration?
Well, as I said before, I think the key assumption, and as Nick's pointed out, is that the trends in the recent past are indicative of the trends in the near future, and that assumption doesn't quite work as is in the CMI model right now, because the model is going through this resetting period. It kind of breaks in the presence of COVID-19, a new cause of death. You've got essentially a step change in the level of base mortality, and the model's trying to do too many things at once. Essentially, the reset is getting carried forward into the future due to this assumption underpinning the model, and almost there's three different uses of the CMI model. One for smoothing through past experience, so that you can use it for an experience analysis, and for projecting your future forward. And you almost need two separate calibrations of the model, to one for each.
Nick, Matt, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, I think Roshan's exactly right on that. I think the challenge is we don't have very much data to do the latter thing that he described at the moment. So yeah, it is a bit of a difficult problem. Having said that, the question was, are the conceptual assumptions of the CMI model appropriate? I think they probably are. We just need to wait a few years until COVID's in the rearview mirror and we can see what's happened in 2022, 23, 24, 25, and then maybe we'll be fine, and it'll be obvious what the right thing to do is. But obviously we don't have that luxury of waiting 3 years, and that's why we're here today to debate it.
You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the issues, obviously, with sort of assessing improvements is whatever you observe at any point in time is the product of true improvements, volatility, and idiosyncratic risk, and you can never ever only really know in hindsight which one was dominating at any point in time. Okay, so let's turn our attention to data. Obviously, we've had 2020 and 2021, and I think by and large, sort of the view is that there's skepticism about exactly how much of that data should be brought through, if any at all. But as we're moving out of those 2 years, and we've got 2022 and 2023, and critical to CMI 2022 is how much reliance should be placed on 2022. Can I ask, or who should I call on first? Nick, can I ask you to sort of give me your views on how much reliance you would be placing at the moment on 2022 and 2023 experience in terms of the CMI model?
Yes, you can. And as I said just now, it's really hard to divine a signal from only 2 years of data, which speaks to the problem we're trying to solve. But there is some useful data in that, useful information in that data. Maybe that information is a little bit more qualitative than quantitative in nature, but it's certainly telling us some useful information we can use to set our sort of future projections. There's a couple of examples of that. If we sort of look at the deaths split by COVID and non-COVID deaths, what we can definitely see in the 2022 and 23 data is that we haven't seen a full bounce back to pre-COVID trends in terms of mortality rates, even as the contribution of COVID deaths has kind of diminished to kind of background level. We're still seeing higher mortality even if you strip out those COVID deaths. There's definitely something going on beyond just this virus. And the other thing you can look at is, I guess, chunk the data up into sub seasons or sort of 6 months periods. And I don't know if other people get their magnifying glass and look carefully at the CMI, these SMR charts that come through from week to week. And what I'm seeing in those is in the latter half of 2023, certainly since September, the mortality rates have been pretty benign, and it kind of gives us some grounds for optimism that we're through the worst of things. Whereas the early part of 2023 was pretty heavy. And I guess you can't just look at 2023. If you've only got 2 years of data, you can't just treat 2023 as one solid object and draw a conclusion from it. You need to work with what you got. I think that will, so as Roshan showed, it's likely that CMI 23 is going to lead to a lower rate of improvements than CMI 2022. But it's quite possible that by the time we start getting our hands on that model, we'll have had another few months of benign data. Might have gone through quite a mild winter, and well, it's quite cold here at the moment. And we might think that 50% weight to CMI 23 looks a little bit over aggressive.
Matt, can I bring you in? What do you think about how much of the most recent data we should be using?
Yeah, so I think there's actually a comment just come through on chat which I was going to raise, which is I sort of generally agree with what Nick's saying. I think talking about looking with a magnifying glass, we need potentially to look even closer at it, in the sense that CMI, most of the ONS data that's published and that the CMI model relies on is based on when deaths were registered rather than when they actually occurred. And so you look at the start of 2023 being particularly heavy. Quite a chunk of that is actually deaths at the end of 2022 that weren't registered till 2023. It looks like, looking at the registrations versus the occurrences data, that there's a significant number of extra deaths. So there are always deaths that happened in the previous year, and even a few deaths that happened even further before that take a while to be registered. So you always get some deaths coming through from one year to the next. And in normal terms, in the CMI model, that doesn't matter massively because, firstly, the weight that is placed on different years is basically the same. So it doesn't really matter if you've got some deaths in 2019 versus 2020. It's not a big issue for the model. And secondly, it tends to be that, give or take, it's not exact, but that the numbers sort of net out. So the number coming through from, again, say 2019 to 2020 is about the same as the number coming through from 2020 to 2021. To the extent that it's possible to analyze it, it does look like there's maybe sort of about the order of 10,000 extra deaths coming through from 2022 that are making the start of 2023 look particularly heavy on the registrations measure. And if you take, if you adjust for that, and I don't know that there is a very clear and obvious and clean way of adjusting for it, but making a sort of approximate adjustment and assuming that the registration delays that don't carry on building up into the future such that you get even more deaths from the end of 2023 going into 2024. If you assume that kind of it's been broadly dealt with over 2023, you end up with an even more benign position for 2023. So I think that's something that CMI I know are aware of, because it's sort of set out in one of the mortality monitor reports. But yeah, it's something that will need to be borne in mind when thinking about what to do with CMI 2023. Stepping back, I mean, broadly speaking, I think that the 25% weight to 2022 made a lot of sense at the time. I think the aim of increasing the weight as we get more towards a position where we're more comfortable, that we're kind of on a bit more solid ground, makes a lot of sense. I think there is a question in my mind as to whether 50% is exactly the right place to go, given the data and given the remaining uncertainties on that data. There's a comment saying there will be a consultation on proposals for CMI 2023 early in the new year, both data and parameters, which may include a proposal to adjust the data. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Matt. So, Roshan, can I ask you, what do you think is implicitly being assumed in the default calibration of CMI 2022, and what concerns would you highlight to users that they need to be aware of, rather than just accepting the default parameters?
Yeah, so essentially, by putting 25% weight on 2022 and indicating some weights perhaps for 2023 onwards, the CMI are essentially taking a view on how COVID-19 is going to play out and will play out into the future. But nobody knows. Nobody can tell how it will play out into the future. We might have new evolutions in vaccine technology, etc. On the flip side, our NHS is overwhelmed. What happens if Labour gets in, etc.? All of these sort of key assumptions. There's so much uncertainty in it. So, and if we look back at, even the pre-COVID levels, we've never got the trends quite right. It's successive iterations of the CMI model since 2009. There's always been a change. And so we can almost expect there to be a change year on year. So the default parameterization, it takes a view on COVID. And one of the issues around this is that this is perceived then to be the industry view and and the UK view as well. I work for a global reinsurer, and part of the issue is when you step to other countries, then the question is, what's the UK view versus the US, the etc. views, and it's difficult. It is difficult. It causes problems with communication, etc. And especially with CMI 23, if 50% weight was going to be placed on the 23 data, in my opinion, it would end up double counting the impact of COVID. And users should be aware that the limitations. Well, first of all, the assumptions being made in the CMI model and the limitations of those assumptions.
Nick, what do you think? It sounds like, Roshan, and I'm maybe slightly being naughty and putting words in his mouth, but it sounds like that potentially the default calibration is moving beyond sort of objective sort of calibration of the data into almost guidance. Would that be your view as well?
Yeah, I think the W parameter is a really good example of that. So W 2022. This may be slightly unfair, but it kind of feels like that 25% was arrived at as kind of a Goldilocks approach. It was like not too much weight being put on COVID, not too little weight being put on COVID, and I think it's kind of consensus view. It looks sensible. It was there's nothing. So that W parameter, it's got no intrinsic meaning really, that 25%. And what I'm starting to see is that people are starting to interpret it as having more intrinsic meaning than it does. And sort of say, well, how can I set this 25%, 50%? And instead of sort of looking at what it does to the projection, which is how it was calibrated, I think, and how we, as people who've worked with it a lot, are interpreting it, they're actually sort of treating it as something like the long-term rate, something that can have a real value and has a real meaning. So I think that's quite a big risk with these sort of parameters which don't have intrinsic meaning or sort of intuitive meaning. So yeah.
But equally, you could say that's the same for a lot of the parameters in the model, like the smoothing parameter and things like that, don't really have an intrinsic meaning beyond they're just kind of something that gives you a model that looks like it's roughly the right level of smoothness. And there was a consultation, wasn't there, on the 25%? I think CMI were comfortable that I think they got some responses either side, and quite a lot kind of saying that it was okay. So they were comfortable that they were annoying enough people the right way and making enough people happy. But I agree. It's there isn't a specific meaning other than we are putting some weight on it. So implicitly, we're assuming we being CMI, we're assuming that 2022 has some, it gives us some information as to what the future might hold, because if it didn't, then we wouldn't put any weight on it at all. I think beyond that, CMI are very and deliberately tend not to give sort of advice in that sense, as in, like, there is no default long-term rate, for example. CMI will produce some data to show what long-term rates have been in England and Wales over the historic periods, and what they look like in other countries over historic periods, but they won't come out and say, and by the way, CMI think that a sensible long-term rate is X, because that's not what they're for. Almost, they're just sort of there to produce a model that people can use in a sensible way, and to give them sort of some guidance on how to use it. But they usually stop short of saying, and you should do it in this particular way and use this particular parameterization, which I think is a strength, but also potentially a weakness, because there's the question as to, well, okay, exactly what do you do when you are in this sort of position?
Yes, absolutely right. So let's get to the $1 million question, or a couple of the $1 million questions. I think by and large there's a consensus that relative to CMI 2019, the expectations of mortality improvements should have fallen. And CMI 2022 does show that. Now the question is CMI 2022 the full extent of the change, or are further changes likely to come in CMI 2023 onwards? And who shall I pick on first? Matt, do you want to keep going on that one?
So I think that there is still some uncertainty in where CMI 2023 will land. So it would depend on, firstly, how the rest of 2023 finishes, whether we'll see high excess mortality at the end in the same way as we did in 2022, or whether we'll see, as Nick was alluding to, sort of a more benign finish to the year. If we look at flu statistics, we're not currently looking on track to have a year with high levels of flu like we saw at the end of 2022. Part of that sort of high excess towards the end of the year was definitely because we, alongside most other European countries, had a particularly sort of high levels of flu circulating at the end of that year. But we're still relatively early in the flu season, so the outcome even there is not fully certain. And if you look at kind of statistics from the NHS on things like waiting times and ambulance response times, they look like they are sort of starting to go north again from the summer months. So it's quite possible that NHS are in for another difficult winter, and so the extent to which that is reflected in mortality is not clear yet. Then the other uncertainties are, so just looking at it from the modelling point of view, it's, well, what weight will be put on 2023 data? It looks like there will be a consultation on CMI 2023 early in the new year, so that's not clear as yet. And yeah, if there's any allowance made for this reporting delay, my sense is that there is some change coming through for CMI 2023. It's hard to say exactly how large that will be, but it's likely to be a sort of further reduction to liabilities. Certainly, if there's any sense of a business as usual type model, then it's likely to be a reduction in liabilities compared to CMI 2022.
Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I'd probably, for this question, point people towards CMI working paper 177, and also Roshan had some similar numbers in his slide pack, which might have come from there, or another working paper. It's got the impact of the proposed core CMI 2023 model with 50% weight 2023 data under different scenarios, and you can kind of divine from that a break-even point. So how heavy would mortality need to be in 2023 to give the same answer as what you get from CMI 2022 in broad terms? And that's my reading is you'd need mortality in 2023 to be about 6% lighter than 2022 to make CMI 23 and 22 have the same strength. So that's a useful benchmark, and that's not going to happen. So I think that means under the current proposal, notwithstanding those points about the late deaths, which I hadn't thought about, but yeah, it feels like there will be a weakening under the proposed core model. And yeah, it's good to hear there'll be a consultation on that. And yeah, as longevity specialists, we can influence that decision. And by the time we get to early 2024, we'll have kind of a better idea of the whole picture for 2023. Think about whether that 50% is the right thing to do or not.
What do you think about that? That if for CMI 23 to be consistent with CMI 2022, that the mortality in 2023 would have to be 6% lighter than it was in 2022. Does that sound like it's behaving sensibly to you?
Well, look, the issue is my model. The CMI model is a data-driven model, and we're going through a strange period of data right now with COVID and everything, and the model, perhaps as it's designed right now, isn't coping very well with that change, that resetting, as I mentioned previously. So yes, it doesn't surprise me that that's the numbers that you'd need to get a the same answer as CMI 22. Now, whether that's correct or not is another story.
So as it stands, I mean, Nick, you mentioned the 6%, and I'm taking that as facts, and I'm going to, probably overstating it. It's probably just an example more than it is. So no one take it to into a pinch of salt. You can ask Nick about it later. But do you think this is to any of the three of you, do you think that in next year we're going to see sort of changes that are equivalent to what we've seen in CMI 2022, or do you think they'll get even bigger, or will they be relatively small? Where do you think we are at the moment?
So if I jump in first on this one, the mortality monitor, Q3 mortality monitor, produced a range of outcomes of different weights and different views of where 23 might lie, and yeah, it ranges from a bigger change than we saw from CMI 21 to 22 to something in the range of like 1% or at the pension ages. In a all of these are in a decrease to life expectancies sort of level, and so it's one of the issues with a data-driven model. Some alternative approaches are required when dealing with a pandemic.
Thank you for allowing me to sort of push you all on this area. Obviously, quite an uncertain time. So let's turn our attention to the usage of the model. We are increasingly seeing, if I get my words in the right order, at least in the life industry, an increased and more sophisticated use of these advanced parameters of the CMI model. So what challenges do you see this that this causes for us, both in terms of the stability of parameters required to produce consistent expectations of improvements, and indeed communication to senior management, who, for obvious reasons, don't want or need to get involved in the model to that level of detail. So who shall I throw this one on first? Matt, can I throw this one at you, if that's all right?
Yeah. So I guess I agree that it is harder to work with. Basically, the one of the good things about the CMI model generally has always been that, you know, a key strength of it has been that essentially it is a common currency. People understand what each other are saying when they use particular versions of the CMI model. The fact that it's sort of harder to come up with a version of the model that produces consistent outcomes is, as in, I suppose, sort of almost the answer. My answer that I might have given to the previous question. So we'd be looking at it a different way. If mortality in 2023 is similar to, you know, within a range of what I might have expected at the start of 2023, then I might expect the next version of the CMI model to produce a broadly similar liability to the previous one, and it's not. And that is a bit of a concern and sort of hard to communicate as to why that might be happening, or equally hard to come up with a version of the model or a calibration of the model that that does what we want it to. I'm not sure what the answer to it is necessarily. I think it's just, as we've sort of mentioned several times, we're in a bit of a position of uncertainty and flux still following COVID. So I'm not sure I've answered this question particularly well, but I think that's kind of, yeah, where it's difficult to come up with something with a better proposal that's going to keep that sort of common currency and keep that sort of understandability of what's going on with the model.
And just a reminder to the audience, if you do have any questions, start adding them into the chats. I'll shortly be hoping to bring in a few of those questions. But Nick, can I ask you the same question regarding the sort of, you know, stability and communication? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it depends on which parameters we're talking about. So some of the parameters under the bonnet that people get involved with and probably have done pre-COVID, like I suppose a good example might be age shape of the long-term rates or the convergence periods, things like that. I think whilst they're advanced parameters, they're intuitive, easy to communicate, and importantly have a kind of consistent meaning from year to year. I think it's the less intuitive parameters which are a bit trickier. So yeah, we talked earlier about both the W parameter and the S kappa parameter not really having an intrinsic meaning. So, but having said that, they're really, really useful parameters because you can use them to tweak and come up with a projection which meets a kind of defined set of criteria. So it doesn't mean they're bad parameters, it just means there's a communication challenge there to senior stakeholders to explain that, I suppose, two things. One, just because we set W 2022 to 33 and the third this year doesn't mean that's what we're going to use every year, and this is why. And then explain clearly why you've landed on what you've landed on for those sort of more wobbly parameters. So yeah, I don't think it's an insoluble problem, it's just a communication challenge.
Can I just play that back? I think we're suggesting that the weight we put on a particular year, you would see that changing from one variant to the other. So we might have put 25% on 2022.
Yeah.
Might go up to might down to 15% or go up to 30%, you know, as needed to make it produce the same outcome you had previously.
Yeah, exactly. So if you think, I think the run rate of improvements post-COVID is going to be 0.5% per annum based on all my research, and the way I've achieved that is by tweaking the W parameter, then as long as you communicate that, when you come to the next year and the same value for the W parameter gives a completely different projection, and you've got another W parameter to worry about. As long as you've clearly set out why you selected the parameterization you did, then you can kind of have a starting point of something similar, and then obviously got another year of data and you adjust accordingly. But yeah, as long as no one thinks that that W parameter of 33 1/3 is set in stone and was set because of this, that, and the other, but understand how it was set, I think that's fine.
All right. So Matt mentioned the idea of common currency, and I think for me that has always been one of the most important things that exists around the CMI model, in the ability to sort of have a language we can talk about. If we're going to see an increasing sort of expression of the best estimate being CMI XXXX advanced, that's probably reducing that somewhat. So Roshan, what changes would you like to see take place in the CMI model that might help restore that common currency, such that the minor differences can be accepted because the default parameters are good enough? Not suggesting necessarily right here, right now, but over the next 5 years as we get back to a norm.
Well, I question whether we need that common currency anymore. Over time, with cause of death modeling, especially during the pandemic, and driver-based analysis becomes a lot more important. It becomes very, very difficult to then express the view as a common currency. From one insurer, reinsurer to the next. The shape of mortality improvements might vary dramatically, and dramatically from the CMI framework as well. We've got a question in the chat here about should we be using the CMI model to express our view, but derive that view separately using a different, more stable method? And yeah, I wholly agree with that. The CMI model, whilst when it first came out in 2009, had the parameters that we need. You see over time, with the introduction of more and more advanced parameters, that the users are requesting more flexibility over time. And so it just becomes more and more difficult to get back to that. Okay, I'm using CMI with a long-term rate of 1.3. You're using CMI with a long-term rate of 1.5. Okay, I know that my view is a little bit more aggressive than your view. That sort of framework doesn't quite exist anymore, I think.
Nick, Matt, anything you'd like to add regarding sort of a common currency?
I definitely agree with Roshan and on his response to the question on deriving the view using a different method. I think that's really important. I think Nick's touched on that as well, that essentially, you can't just sort of assume that using the same version of the CMI model, or you can't just assume that going from one version of the model with the same parameterization means the same thing from year to year. I disagree on the common currency point solely because I think it's still important within certainly as a kind of pensions consultancy type area. I think trying to introduce more sort of flavors of the model and more kind of esoteric, this is how we're doing it, but someone else is doing it some different way, and trying to square the circle and work out what that means for a particular strength of the valuation and things like that, I think is just gets impossible. I think when you're just arguing over one or two parameters, then that's a much easier place and a much kind of more comfortable place to be, provided you can come up with something that is sensible, that someone else can understand.
So I'm going to bring in a couple of questions in a minute, but just to sort of sum up this section, I'm going to sort of ask you sort of a key question to sort of allows you to sort of close out your thoughts. So I'll start with Nick. Does the CMI model framework still work as is, or are further expansions of how users modify the model likely to be required?
Okay, so meaty question. Yeah, well, as Matt and Roshan said, there's plenty of knobs and whistles already on the CMI model. It's very flexible already and can make it do just about anything you want it to do. So I think it does work as it is. I think what is, going back to my comments right at the start of this, it's about what you use it for. So I don't think the way it's structured at the moment, it can be used both looking backwards and looking forwards. What you can do is use two different parameterization in the CMI model, and because it's so flexible, you can make it do whatever you want backwards and whatever you want to forwards, and then knit it together in the middle. So yeah, I think in terms of parameters, I think there's probably arguments for increasing the number of parameters which are deemed core extended. You hear these arguments. There's probably potentially argument for relegating one or two back into the under the bonnet as advanced parameters. I think one which we haven't touched on today, but I think is quite, it's parameter which is quite important in the context of the very low starting rates that are going to come through as we allow for COVID, is the convergence period. So the default value for that, and this is an advanced parameter, is 20 years, although that varies by age. Now, I think there's an argument to be made that whatever's driving these very low level improvements that we're modeling, it won't take 20 years for those to work through the system. So I think it shouldn't necessarily be promoted to an extended parameter or anything like that. I think maybe it should have a bit more prominence at the point where the starting rate is quite a long way from the long-term rate. And maybe just to finish on a positive note, I guess the reason we can have this detailed discussion on these nuanced points of detail is because of the hard work of the CMI Projections Committee over the years, and for their work in maintaining it from year to year. So whilst we've been picking nits for the last hour, they're doing really good work.
Don't worry, Nick. I'm sure they've got that check in place for that statement. No, you're absolutely right. Whilst the purpose of this webinar is to sort of poke and critique and think about it from a user perspective, it is not to undermine or challenge the very important work the CMI does generally, and the Mortality Projections Committee does in particular. So well said, Matt. What do you think?
I think I generally agree with Nick. It works the best it can. I don't think that any model would have been able to do anything much with certainly 2020 and 2021 data. And there's a bunch of people thinking hard and about what to do with this most recent data. So it's definitely a difficult job in terms of expanding further the core and extended parameters. I'm always a bit wary of that, because if you give people a lever to play with, they will play with it and decide that produces a better answer for some particular reason than another one. I think having the consultation makes a lot of sense. Having a sort of clear rationale for coming up with what's come up with for the core parameterization, and giving people the option to kind of move things away from that core parameterization, using the mainly certainly within pensions consulting world, mainly it will be the core parameters and the extended parameters. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the convergence point is one that's well made, and I think it makes a lot of sense for CMI to have a think about those parameters. But whether or not we move them forward to the core advanced, I know core or extended, which I know Nick, you did say that you didn't think that was necessarily the right thing to do. I would think that is probably not warranted, but definitely thinking about them in the context of the experience that we've had makes some sense.
Roshan, what do you think? Do you think we can live with it as is, or would you see further expansions being required?
I wouldn't say we could live with it as is, because the problem is, well, when I say as is, I mean for calibration. Because as Nick has pointed out, there's two uses of the CMI model. One is to bring a base table up to the current date, and one is to project your view of mortality improvements forward. And you almost need two separate calibrations of the model to get something sensible for both. And that's something that sometimes is overlooked. And the more weight you apply on the pandemic period, the more you'll need to change your future view of mortality improvements by adjusting the bits under the hood, as it were, be that the convergence period or the direction of travel or the A parameter, etc. Because of the assumptions underlying the CMI model when it moves from the past to the future. I think one change that I would like to see actually, which may help, it would be a new data set which excludes COVID-19 from the calibration data for the projection of future improvements, because the step change that we get from COVID, is a problem for the model. There's issues with that, of course. What is a COVID death? What's recorded as, how's that changed? The recording of that changed over time. But this could be caveated, of course. The CMI already caveat this when you change the data set to something else. It's there in the projection in big bold red. So yeah, there's other modifications that could be made. But I think the key thing is you almost need two models. And CMI model has always been two models fixed into one, but now more like importantly than ever, it needs to be separated.
Thank you. That's sort of an interesting point to finish on. I'm going to bring in a question that we've had, and the question comes, I think it's from Adele. In terms of communications, could the CMI use this opportunity to present results that are ranges rather than single point estimates, so that when a comparison is made from year to year, the question is whether the figure falls in the range rather than a percentage change from a point estimate? So widening that out, should rather than a default value, should a potential range be shown from what they've assessed as being a reasonable upper range and a reasonable lower range be presented, and then the user's left to determine that? Maybe that's a broader question, but who would like to sort of tackle that one? Who can I bring in?
I'll jump in. I think that'll be really useful. We don't have a long-term rate as a default parameter purely because it's uncertain, but the weight parameter itself is uncertain, and the communication of that weight parameter, of course, 25% weight doesn't mean 25% change in your liabilities, etc. Having a range, or even having no value at all, and leaving it up to the user, especially in this sort of for things which are highly uncertain, will be incredibly useful.
I'm maybe misremembering, but I'm pretty sure that in the working papers there are various sensitivities to changing lots of the kind of key parameters. They're not. Again, I haven't got a version of the working paper in front of me, but I think there are. It's quite a detailed paper. I'm pretty sure there are some sensitivities in there, albeit that they're not kind of maybe presented in the way of this is the range. It's just kind of, if we go up a bit from this particular parameter or down a bit from this parameter, this is what the impact on life expectancies are. I think there is that already sort of in the working paper, or whether sort of bringing some of that more front and center potentially could be quite useful. As I said in my answer to the previous question, I think I'm a bit wary always of giving people more decisions to make and more levers to pull, because I don't know. I just think there is a sort of merit in making it as simple as possible. Having said that, equally, we are in uncertain times, so a little bit more kind of giving people things to change. Maybe that is the way to do things. But yeah, I'm a little bit aware of that.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we are getting rather timed out. It's been a real fascinating, well, I found it a really fascinating discussion. I hope you guys at home have as well. And I just want to thank Roshan, Nick and Matt for sparing their time and their thoughts and their insight to share with us. And I hope you find it as useful as I did. We'll see you next time. Take care. Goodbye.